Hello, everyone, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today and share my family and my grandmother's personal experience of what happened to her. So, I was going to introduce myself, but you did most of that job. So, but yes, I'm Josh. I'm actually 27 years old. I'm from Aberdeen, and most of my working career was in social care. And I say was, no longer. I might work in social care. But yes, I spent 7 years. First of all, I started off supporting people with learning and physical disabilities, and then that sort of progressed on to supporting elderly people towards the end of their life, caring for them as they were facing terminal illnesses, such as what my grandma faced towards the end of her life. So yeah, I'm currently the communications and office manager for an MSP, Karen Adam, and most of my political experience, because I'm quite involved in politics, as I've stood for election myself a few times with the SNP. Most of the social policy issues I cared about was about LGBT inclusion, working class issues, making sure, fighting poverty and stuff like that. I never thought my involvement with campaigning for a policy such as assisted dying would be as much as it is, but because of what I experienced my own loved one, my grandmother, go through, it's something that was never in question. So I'll maybe go on to talk about why. So my first actual interaction with assisted dying was when I was actually a child. I had an aunt who lived with multiple sclerosis, and towards the end of her life, as the quality of her life started to vastly deteriorate, it was something she considered. So it was always on my radar. She never went through with it. She ended up dying of complications due to MS, but it was always something we'd been quite aware of, myself as a person growing up. So last year, I was living in Glasgow at the time, working for a local authority in social care. And I got a call from my mum. It was late at night, in a stormy August evening. It was something to think of, like, out of a strange story, but it was quite eerie. One late night in August, I got a phone call from my mum, and there was a real sense of urgency in my mum's voice. She called me and says, Josh, Grandma isn't doing well at all. The doctors have said she can go at any time. I think it's time. I think you need to come back to Aberdeen to say your goodbyes. It's not looking good. So she initially told me, she said, come tomorrow morning. But at the time I thought, I can't wait that long. If it's going to be imminently, I want to say goodbye. My grandma was of sound mind. She was awake. I left that night, and I remember only packing enough clothes for a few days because the doctors had said that it would be imminent. She'd go at any time. But yeah, it wasn't a few days, and I wish looking back now it had been, because what happened, what she went through was something no person should ever be forced to go through. So we're advised she was in palliative care at the end of her life. So, I didn't know then that when I arrived at my grandma's bedside in the early hours of the morning that night, that I'd spend the next 18 days watching her prolonged, insufferable death while she was in sustained suffering. So it's certainly the hardest thing that I've ever had to watch. It's certainly the hardest thing all of my family's ever had to watch. But it's nothing in comparison, like what we watched her going through. It's nothing in comparison to what she must have felt in the last days of her life. And even though it was a hard thing to watch, I would never let my grandma die alone. Particularly in the state that she was in. So I remember when I arrived at her bedside, seeing the physical state she was in, it was really emotional. I immediately burst into tears. She was quite often in and out of consciousness and waking up. And every time she'd wake up, the first thing she would always say is, "Oh, agony, sore," always expressing how painful it was, in the state she was in. And quite well, I remember one of the first things she said, she went, "It's time, I need to go." And she often said, one of the things that stick with me is that she often say, "They wouldn't let an animal suffer like this. Why is this taking so long?" And she'd beg to die. Imagine watching a loved one beg to an end of their life. And I never thought that I would wish anyone dead, let alone a family member. That's something that really sticks with you. So my grandma, who was she? Her name was, her full name was Charlotte Mary Ryan, often known as Mary Ryan. She was a devoutly religious woman, hence why she went by Mary, because she loved the Virgin Mary. And, I'm not religious at all. I often call myself a super atheist. I don't really subscribe to those views anymore, but she was. My grandma was a religious woman, and she was ready to meet her maker. And she also wanted a dignified death, but she was denied that under the current law. So she would have taken the option for a dignified death if it had been available to her, but unfortunately it wasn't. So in the last days of my grandma's life, Mary Ryan's life, she was diagnosed with multiple organ failure, and she also had a cancerous tumour in her throat. Now, she also had, because she was an elderly woman getting on in age, she had one vocal cord left. So she was given the option, do you want to have treatment to treat the cancerous tumour in your throat? However, there's a risk that it'll damage the last vocal cord in your throat and you won't be able to speak for the rest of your life, however long that may be. Or, you can live life to some degree of, you won't be in suffering, you'll be in some pain, but we can manage that with pain medication. And so my grandma says, "No, I think I'd like to have quality of life before I go. I've got, had a very close family. We rallied around her, and she wanted to die in her own home rather than a hospice. And that was a choice that I think everyone should respect for anyone. So she was offered treatment and she declined it because the risk of losing the last vocal cord, being unable to speak, wasn't an option for my grandma. So I remember, when the nurses would often come down, when they visited, they'd often say, "We'll do everything we can to make Mary comfortable." But what she went through, there was no comfort in what she lived through. The pain and suffering and was horrendous, really horrendous. There's no comfort in that. And that's not to criticise the health professionals that were caring for her. They did everything they could to the best of their ability within the remits of what they could do. But the system, as it is now, isn't fit for purpose for people who are at the end of their life and who do not want to live through insufferable pain. So 5 days after my arrival to Aberdeen, my grandma agreed with her doctors that she would be taken off food and fluids. And this was to ease her journey into passing. So already 5 days previous, we'd been told that her death was imminent, but this is still 5 days on through horrendous pain. So she's taken off food and fluids, and she agreed to that. And they also said that this would avoid the risk of her choking with the cancerous tumour in her throat. So when this decision was made, my grandma and the family who rallied around her were told, people who are taken off food and fluids, they don't live longer than 4 days. And I wish that statement had been true, because 4 days of suffering was a lot better than the 13 days that she lived without food or fluids. It was, horrendous. And those 13 days I can say with no qualms, it was the toughest 13 days of my life, my family's, and my grandma's life as well. And, there's conversations when my grandma was out of consciousness. She's seen me as her politics grandson, the SNP grandson. She used to call me Jossie. And one of the conversations she had, she went, Jossie, this isn't a life for nobody. That's how she speaks. This isn't a life for nobody. She went, you need to do something about this. So we had a conversation, and she made me promise, and I'd made this promise to her that I would do everything I could to make sure no one else has to go through what she went through in those last days. So in those last days, she was given morphine and everything else you could think of, you name it. It didn't work. She was coming into consciousness, expressing her pain. The care she got was excellent. She was getting carers in 3 times a day. She was getting nurses in 3 times a day. And me, I basically moved in with her to care for her in between when the nurses and carers weren't there. And her state deteriorated so much that I remember, something that will never leave me is the sound of, my own mum watching her own mum in the state she was in. It was so bad, I would hear her vomiting in the toilet, watching her own mother drowning in her own bodily fluids. And it's something, I remember looking at my grandma, because I'd quite often have to go in, and I'm sorry for being so descriptive with this, but I think it's really important I am to get the message across to how vile some people's deaths are, and it's not something anyone should have to live through. Her bodily fluids would be bubbling over her mouth, drowning, and I, or carers or nurses, whoever was there at the time, I'd have to stick my fingers in my grandma's mouth and throat and pull out fluids so she could breathe. It's not, and I'm sorry for getting emotional in this, but that was the state quite often pretty much was in, so my grandma could actually talk towards the end of her life. Now, that was just part of the agony, and there's details I won't share to protect as much of her dignity as possible. But the fact that bodily fluids are bubbling out of her almost constantly, and the sound it made was like a lion's roar, with volcanic eruption of bodily fluids out of her mouth. So, someone who's worked in social care, who's experienced this, quite often, it's not something you'd ever imagine you'd have to experience with your own loved one, your own family member. But someone who's worked in social care, it was drummed into me, when you're caring for someone who needs support, you take a person-centered approach in every aspect of decision-making as part of their care package. So why is that then removed when someone's deemed to be dying or in palliative care? Why can't someone have choice over how they die when they know they are going to die? It's something that doesn't sit right with me as someone who's been on both sides of the situation, caring for dying people and seen it, and caring for my grandma who was dying herself. In a way, to me, there's already an aspect of assisted dying in this country. So when my grandma and the doctors decided she would be taking off food and fluids, that was then the decision that she was going to die, there and then. So why was she then forced to endure 13 days of horrific torture? Because that's exactly what it was. Horrific torture someone went through in the last days of their lives, crying and begging to die. Is that really okay? Because to me, it's not. Social care was always my passion, supporting people. I've got a lot of family who are, have physical or learning disabilities, so caring for people has always been quite natural to me. I've never worked in social care since I witnessed my grandma's death and I had to care for it. I can't go back to it. That was that traumatic. For me as a grandson, for my mother, I can't imagine how she feels. My grandma, I can't even tolerate to think of what... it's too much to think about for me, but anyway. What I really think we need to do is take a rights-based approach to this. I understand people have religious views, but you can't say to someone, well, by the way, you can't end your life because you're in insufferable pain because John down the road's a Catholic. It doesn't make sense, you know. It needs to be a rights-based approach so everyone has the choice over their own care, a person-centred approach to when it comes to palliative care and the choice of how someone dies. And, you know, for me, there's a more sense of urgency than there ever was now. Because, you know, just this week actually, my family, a close family member of mine received bad news that they were diagnosed with leukemia. So that aspect of this has never been more urgent for me, you know, and I really hope assisted dying is something that is introduced into Scotland very soon. Ali, you said something earlier in a speech, and you mentioned that the suffering that some people have experienced is beyond the realm of human comprehension. And I really feel like my grandma lived through that, and I witnessed my grandma live through that. I've never been able to find the words to get out there how horrible it is to watch someone go through that. I know it's something, you know, my family often discuss. The memories of my grandma is quite often shrouded now with how she died. And she's a really lovely woman. She's a funny person. She's always the centre of attention, a bit of like we used to always call her an actress, you know. She used to do some dances at, you know, family get-togethers and loved children and babies, but all that's quite often forgotten now because of how she died. When we talk about grandma, it's always about how we need to change the law on assisted dying. It's always about how traumatic her death was. It's always about making reference to the horrific things that happened. A lot of the things that happened have gone unspoken here because, you know, we need to protect our dignity as well. So what can we do? Liam, you're bringing in a bill, which I sincerely hope gets the backing of the Scottish Parliament. I'll do everything I can to lobby my parliamentarian, my MSP, and I really urge everyone here to please do the same. Thank you so much.